traditional mechanisms of reform work anymore. You know, that the piecemeal and incremental reform that was made possible by a liberal class, it's gone. The liberal class is gone. It's been replaced by a faux liberal class, embodied in figures like Clinton or Obama. It was Clinton who gave us NAFTA. It was Clinton who destroyed the welfare system, and at the time 70% of the recipients were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC and turned the airwaves over to roughly a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Clear Channel. It was Clinton that destroyed Glass-Steagall and ripped down the firewalls between investment and commercial banks, precipitating both the national and the global financial crisis. And it was Clinton that gave us the omnibus bill, which exploded the prison population. And why? Because Clinton understood that by doing corporate bidding, he would get corporate money. And by the 1990s, the Democratic Party, which had once been a home to at least that traditional liberal class, which, as Chomsky points out, is never designed to be the political left. It's designed to be the kind of safety valve to ameliorate suffering, as Roosevelt did during the New Deal. Although he would take the agendas of more radical parties like the Progressive Party and others. And Roosevelt says, my greatest achievement was that I saved capitalism. And Roosevelt's right. But now that is gone. I wrote a book called Death of the Liberal Class, which spends a lot more time talking about this. And in a way, you have to go back to Marx, because the system is so myopic that built within it, as Marx pointed out, is the seeds of its own self-annihilation, which is precisely where we are. So if you take the Occupy movement, the grievances that were addressed in terms of inequality, in terms of work, in terms of student loans, which throws most college students into an untenable debt peonage, which is a form of social control, as African Americans in this country have experienced since emancipation. It was a mainstream movement. And the response of the state was to physically eradicate, under the direction of Barack Obama, all of those encampments. Now that for me was a very chilling sign. And I was a foreign correspondent for 20 years. I covered all of most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, both Palestinian uprisings, the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. So as a reporter, I'm very attuned to the kindling that ignites social unrest. So Krugman will write about a rational response. And he's right in that sense, that a rational response would have been a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, especially targeted at people under the age of 25, and a rational healthcare system, i.e. The public option or universal healthcare for all. That would have been rational, but it didn't do that. It spoke exclusively in the language of force, and now there is this subterranean war across the country against those within the Occupy movement, which never, you know, in terms of numbers, I don't think it ever exceeded about 300,000 people. But we are watching across the country these people being neutralized by the state through the wholesale surveillance, courtesy of Edward Snowden, that we now know was going on. And that always means that because the state cannot respond rationally, and because corporations have no self-imposed limit, that they will just grab more and more and more, eventually there will be blowback. But what frightens me, as somebody who comes out of the left, is that all of the populist and radical movements that opened up the spaces in this democracy, the Liberty Party, the labor movement, the suffragists, the civil, they've all been destroyed. I mean, in a way that is not in Europe. There's still a residue of it in Europe. And what we have in terms of funding and organization are proto-fascist movements. The lunatic fringe of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, the Christian right, which we cannot discount, homegrown militias. And America is a deeply violent culture, and these people speak in the language of traditional fascism. They celebrate violence, they fuse the iconography and language of the state with religion, and they have demonized the vulnerable. Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, feminists, a very long list of people they despise. And you can't take that rhetoric lightly in a time of social turmoil. I covered Yugoslavia. I watched the propaganda campaigns that eventually created that fratricide in Yugoslavia. So something's going to happen. What will happen? There will be an eruption. Will it call itself Occupy? Will it look like Occupy? Probably not. I mean, the lesson that I learned covering movements is that what ignites it is unknowable, unforeseeable, and often benign. And that even the purported leaders of movements never know when it's going to happen. So on February 9th, 1989, I was in Leipzig with the leaders of the East German opposition, the people who organized the opposition that brought down Honecker. And they said, maybe within a year we will have free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a few hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. But even that was a very important lesson for me. So something's coming. What, how, we don't know. It's always the ruling elite that determines the configurations of rebellion. And they are going to push. I mean, look what they've done. They've slashed food stamps. Our chronic unemployment and underemployment is staggering. The LA Times said we have an unemployment rate of 17%. When you count people who have stopped looking for work and are no longer counted in the system, or you count people, the working poor, people who have a job but their income puts them below the poverty line. And I think that's why, I don't know. I mean, things are stacked against us. I'm talking about on the ground. But the only hope left is to build mass movements of such a degree and that can be sustained, that we can begin to put pressure on these corporate forces, which Eugene ticked them off. But in essence, what has happened is we have undergone a corporate coup d'etat. And we just saw another example of that with the Supreme Court ruling on the unlimited campaign finance by figures like Adelson. And I mean, we haven't even discussed the environmental crisis, but it's intimately twinned with the economic crisis. They know, I mean, 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice melts, and Shell Oil looks at it as a business opportunity. I have 4 kids, and I don't like going to jail. It's more time than I care to donate to the US government, frankly. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs, by the way, which, I know they recruit on this campus, or they're all over there having drinks at Ivy. That is your responsibility to call them out when they come to your campus. I mean, they are the largest commodity index traders in the world, and I covered the famines in the Sudan. I know what it means when they jack up the prices of wheat to make profit. It means children starve to death and die. And that was, my impetus for sitting down in front of the doors of Goldman Sachs until we were taken away. So, I mean, as a father, I don't think it does any good to be Pollyannish or engage in an Oprah-like hope that's an illusion. I think we have to face the reality that's in front of us. But as a father, even if I fail, I want my kids to say that he tried. And it's your generation that's going to pay the price for our crimes. And it's incumbent upon you not to be seduced, which is very easy to do at a school like Princeton, by these very elite forces that, I speak as a former seminarian, are in theological terms forces of death. Well, it's interesting that the prisoners are fascinated by white-collar crime and what Wall Street has done. I mean, because they catch that disparity. And we've destroyed the legal system. We've created a 2-tiered legal system where, for the elites, they write their own laws, they write their own regulations. Goldman Sachs can commit verifiable fraud and remains not only unpunished, but gets basically 0% interest loans from the Federal Reserve. And that's very frightening. because what you've created is an elite that can't be touched by the law. And I mean, this gets into economic theory, Carl Polanyi and even Marx, that unfettered, unregulated capitalism is a revolutionary force. It has no self-imposed limits. It commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities. The natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. We see that with the fossil fuel industry. They're the very death throes of the planet are an opportunity for profit. And at the same time, in these marginal communities, we have created on the ground omnipotent police forces, which Eugene illustrated so well in the film. And Hannah Arendt, in Origins of Totalitarianism, writes about the danger of the creation of omnipotent police forces vis-a-vis the stateless. She herself had fled Germany and was stateless. And she said that when you create these omnipotent police forces, i.e., people can be stopped, many people in my class, some of them did horrible things without question. But there's no question that whatever percentage, I don't know, but there are people in there who were completely railroaded. They're stacked with charges, most of which are absurd, and then if they don't plea out, the pressure is to get them to plea out. And I mean, the percentages are staggering. And please, what's it, almost 90%? 90%. So, for instance, in this class,
it's like saying that the courtrooms in federal court buildings and in state court buildings barely get used. All of the deal making is happening in bathrooms and lobbies and stairwells.
And it's done in 15 or 20 minutes. Yeah. So, I mean, I have in the class a guy who had been on the U.S. Army boxing team and was about to go pro, and he got picked up for something he didn't do. And I work with a group of ex-prisoners in Elizabeth, so that's where he's from. I mean, the story is famous. And he wouldn't plea out, because if he pled out for 10 years, his boxing career would have been over. And because he wouldn't plea out, they hit him with 30 years. That's an example of how broken the legal system is, both from top to bottom. And Arendt writes that the danger is that when you create these omnipotent police forces that are essentially beyond the law, that are capable of doing anything, and I think, again, Eugene's film captures this, then as society begins to experience a period of instability or unrest, suddenly these omnipotent police forces, which are already sanctioned under law, appear everywhere. And you're seeing it now, as Eugene pointed out, in poor rural white communities in the meth, with the meth epidemic. And we are seeing that among activists, among Occupy activists. The fact is that the Occupy movement was heavily dependent on electronic forms of communication, which worked really well at the time. But what it did, because of the wholesale surveillance, is identify them to the state. And the sort of unreported story is that all of these activists are now being neutralized. So we have court case after court case. I mean, I'll just give you one that I'm involved in. One of the activists was picked up with a pair of scissors in his hand in Zuccotti and charged with assault with a deadly weapon against a police officer. And they filmed Zuccotti 24 hours a day, but they didn't have film of that. They wouldn't let him plea out because he was in the courtroom. They said he was on the Homeland Terrorism Security List. And then finally what they did is give him 5 years of probation, which essentially means that he can't do any activism because otherwise he's going to slap with that 7. That is now happening across the country. So I think that the decay within the judicial system, both at the lower levels and at the higher levels, is one that's become extremely frightening. Well, just in terms of Mexico, it's NAFTA. So you push through NAFTA, you drive, we don't know, 3 to 5 million Mexican farmers off their land because agribusinesses can undersell them. That increases migration. It creates the same kind of breakdown in Mexican communities that you see in the inner city with all the attendant problems. It's why, the killings and the rise of the drug lords in northern Mexico took place, the same way it takes place in Camden or Newark. I mean, it's you know, global capitalism is a phenomena that doesn't respect borders at all and is rapidly creating a global, not just a national, but a global neo-feudalism of masters and serfs. And in many ways, and I guess Eugene can talk about this too, I mean, in many ways, I think what you see in northern Mexico is, for the same reason, precisely what you're seeing in poor pockets of the United States. Superfluous labor, forced into the underground economy to survive, with a rise of chaotic, almost anarchic violence on the part of both law enforcement and a criminal class.
Where does human dignity lie writ large? Where does our obligation as a country, as a leader among equals? That's heartbreaking, but it is the case, and I have to play in the currency of the realm. And so the movie sought to let the full story of what's happening in the drug war, which is the shift from race to class, unfold. And so I was able to try to portray, look, this is a racial story that has now evolved into a class story, because when Nixon sort of unleashed the hounds of the war by calling it a war on drugs, and I give credit to Nixon where it's due, because he's frankly far more progressive than Obama and anyone else operating today, which is an amazing thing to be able to say, I guess, about Obama, but also about Nixon. But he unleashed it, and when it was declared a war, all of a sudden the dogs of war got unleashed. And the dogs of war are all of the things we see with military-industrial corruption, you know, vested interests, profiteering, all that. And so now, something that had been an ad hoc series of racist laws, a sequence of just sort of impulse racism, now got codified into an economically driven machinery of war that consumes human beings for profit. All those industrial complexes put profit before people. None other than the military-industrial complex so directly feeds human beings into a machine and dollars come out the other end. And the idea that that's one of the largest businesses in America and such a vast employer, there are 2.3 million Americans in jail, but 7 million under correctional control, 7 million people. Right? So you start to think about numbers that truly rank with some of the history's most prominent persecutions. So I wanted to tell that full story so that Americans would say what Charles Ogletree says, which is, this is coming to a theater near you. This is not just other people that it's affecting. And I almost didn't want to say that, because you ought to care per se. But if it helps, I'll add in that you're next. So it was
you know, just to throw out on Nixon, he was the last liberal president, not because he was a liberal or had a conscience, but because he was scared of movements. And there's that scene in Kissinger's memoirs, Don't Go By the Book, where Kissinger and Nixon are looking at through the window of the White House at a huge anti-war demonstration. Nixon has taken empty buses end to end to ring the White House, and he's wringing his hands going, Henry, Henry, they're gonna break through the barricades and get us. And that is where you want people in power to be, as Karl Popper has pointed out in The Enemies in Open Societies. Power is the problem. In terms of journalism, and let me speak as somebody who spent 15 years at the New York Times, where the unwritten motto of the New York Times is, do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for access and power. You can alienate them sometimes, but not all the time. And the really good reporters, Sidney Schanberg and others, who just won't let up. Sidney went after the real estate developers who have now destroyed Manhattan. But these developers were all the friends of the publisher. And Sidney, who had won, you may have ever saw The Killing Fields, it was about him, and he was pushed out, like a lot of other good reporters. But all great journalism is almost never done by the mainstream. It's done by people like Eugene, who are not serving or not trying to sort of placate commercial interests on whom they depend for money, or people in power on whom they depend for access. And access for a paper like the New York Times is very important. So in the 1960s, you have Ramparts magazine, run by Bob Scheer, who runs the website Truthdig I write for, out of LA. So Ramparts never makes a dime. Bob, who's never made a dime in his life, always has great financial schemes. And the one for Ramparts was that he took an ad from the back of Time magazine for Pan Am and put it on the back of Ramparts. thinking that other advertisers would think he was respectable and then maybe he could get advertising. And the only thing he got was that Pan Am sued him to take the ad off of the back of Ramparts. But Ramparts exposed COINTELPRO. Ramparts printed that iconic photo of the girl burned by napalm, the naked girl running down the road. And Martin Luther King was sitting in an airport with Ralph Abernathy and opened Ramparts and saw that picture and pushed his food away. And Abernathy said, "Is there something wrong with your food?" And King said, "Nothing's going to taste right till I get up and denounce this war." And you can go back through the history of American journalism. I.W. Wells, the great crusader against lynching, who exposed that lynching had nothing to do with black men very rarely raping white women, that it was a reign of terror with her newspaper office being burned down in Memphis. I.F. Stone, blacklisted by McCarthy, couldn't even get a job at The Nation magazine, starts I.F. Stone's Weekly in his basement. And those forces have always put pressure on traditional commercial media to do their job. And that's how it works. They don't get credit for it. So, you know, journalism has been reconfigured with the decline of newsprint. And that monopoly that that the newsprint had connecting sellers with buyers is gone. I mean, now we're all profiled on Google. And so, you know, whatever you look at on eBay or anything else is going to pop up on your screen. And that means that that ability to be a mainstream journalist and collect a middle-class salary is over, despite what journalism schools are telling you. If you go out and do journalism, you are going to be a member of the working class. You are not going to be able, as I was, to make a very comfortable New York Times salary with benefits. Those days are gone. And it means, in essence, that journalism, like the arts, like the humanities, are being pushed to the margins of society. Anything that has the capacity to speak to truth or beauty or transformation in a corporate state, as in all totalitarian states, are being crushed. And you see it at state universities where they depend on state budgets. And departments have to raise their own money. Well, it's very hard to do that if you're in the classics department or the philosophy department. All these departments that teach you how to think rather than what to think. And you know, I often worry that even where it exists in places like Princeton, it becomes almost a kind of boutique kind of refinement before you go off to work for Goldman Sachs. And that you know, as somebody comes steeped in the humanities and sees its vital importance, and steeped in journalism, and my wife went to Juilliard and is an actor, I mean, you just see how that is crushed, and in essence, we're robbed of the language by which we can examine and express our own reality, and I think that's conscious. I think it's on purpose. Well, that already happened in Pennsylvania to prohibit Mumia Abu-Jamal from being filmed or communicating. And when I saw Mumia, I wasn't even allowed a pen and paper. In New Jersey, the laws are phenomenally restrictive. And I think that, you know, one of the fascinating aspects of writing this play, which is pretty raw, is that eventually the prison authorities got wind of it and started pulling members of my class out individually and interrogating them about what was in it. And they would come to the class and go, well, is it because there's cursing? And what they couldn't fathom is that the reality of mass incarceration is something that everyone within the system knows intimately, the guards and the prisoners, but the people on the outside don't. And they don't want the people on the outside to know. And so I think that we will see a move to be more restrictive as you get independent filmmakers and journalists and others who attempt to burrow inside the system and explain it. It's very difficult as a journalist for me to get in the prison I have been trying to go to Maryland to see Sundiata Acoli, who is one of our nation's about 150 political prisoners, former member of the Black Liberation Army. And these people are never getting out, these Panthers and stuff. And I can't. So, I mean, I think that the system, our democratic system is so broken at this point, and we just saw the Supreme Court ruling and this grotesque spectacle of Sheldon Adelson, calling Republican candidates to pay court. I think we have just seen under the Obama administration that it almost doesn't matter what the public wants, what the citizen wants, what rights they have, and we can talk about wholesale surveillance. It's corporations and lobbyists who rule, and these lobbyists are going down and writing the laws because they know what's good for business. Corrections Corp of America, they spend a lot of money in Washington. So, I was a supporter of another Princeton graduate, Ralph Nader. I wrote his speeches for him in 2008 because I think that, and I think Eugene even addressed this in the film, and I was also very supportive and active in the Occupy movement because I think we have to begin to build mass movements. That's the only hope left, and that will include many issues, including mass incarceration. I know there are students here who work in Wagner, and as a reporter who spent all of his career in the developing world, building those relationships, real relationships with the oppressed, especially if you come out of a community of privilege, as we do, is absolutely vital. And somebody spoke about despair, which is real. I mean, you'd have to be very ignorant not to be in despair. And yet, when you build those relationships, such as when I walk out of Rahway, you can't betray those people. You carry their voice. And I think that what will keep you vital and what will keep you passionate and what will keep you from succumbing to cynicism is building real relationships with people who have not had your privilege. And that was true in my own career, whether it was in Gaza, whether it was in El Salvador, whether it was in the Sudan, wherever it was, or now in prison, or the last book I wrote with Joe Sacco was in the poorest pockets of the United States, including Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country. Keep those relationships alive. And if you keep them alive and you carry that pain of the oppressed within you, then you'll never give up, because what's driving you is, in the end, and I think what drove Eugene's film, and that's love.